Welcome to Understanding Our Political Economy, Lesson 1, The Rise of Economics. We begin our study of political economy with a brief explanation of how this interdisciplinary method of scientific inquiry was replaced by segmentation of the social sciences into the distinct disciplines of political science, history, sociology, moral philosophy, and economics. Political economy was actually a subset of the broader field of moral philosophy. Adam Smith, the great political economist of the 18th century, began delivering public lectures in 1748 at the University of Edinburgh, sponsored by the Philosophical Society of Edinburgh under the patronage of Lord Kaimes. Economics narrowed to leave moral, that is, ought questions to moral philosophy. Author Kenneth Locke made this controversial point in his 1991 book, Adam Smith's Mistake: How a Moral Philosopher Invented Economics and Ended Morality. Locke wrote, "Economics is fundamentally different from every other discipline in the academic world, including the other social sciences. No other academic field, unless influenced by economics, teaches and promotes self-interest. All other fields essentially teach knowledge and truth. There is an underlying assumption in our society that if one enters into the temple of intellect, the acquisition of its wares will be of benefit to the individual and to society as a whole." One prominent economist of the early to mid-20th century, Lionel Robbins, stated what he accepted as the boundaries of his discipline, writing, "Economics is neutral as between ends. Economics cannot pronounce on the validity of ultimate judgments of value." Other social scientists see their role as very different from that of the economist. The mathematician Jacob Bronowski, best remembered perhaps for the television series The Ascent of Man, recognized an inherent conflict in human behavior. He concluded, "The problem of values arises only when men try to fit together their need to be social animals with their need to be free men." What he and others understood is that markets operate within systems of law, and systems of law are open to judgment as to fairness and equity. Do the laws establish equality of opportunity or secure and protect entrenched forms of privilege? The philosopher Mortimer J. Adler provided us with a definition of liberty that requires us to examine law against objectively derived moral principles. This has proven to be incredibly difficult, if not impossible. For example, in everyday discourse, we use the terms liberty and freedom interchangeably. Adler makes a crucial distinction, writing, "Liberty is freedom exercised under the restraints of justice, so that its exercise results in injury to no one. Thus, when we exercise freedom, we could well exceed the bounds of liberty and enter into the realm of license, but we must make judgments regarding what is and is not injury and what is just." Another great philosopher, John Locke, provided us with a perspective that described the exercise of license as exceeding the bounds of liberty. License takes two forms, those that people agreed were criminal in effect, and those that allowed some forms of privilege to direct our economic lives. Locke wrote, "To understand political power right and derive it from its original, we must consider what state all men are naturally in, and that is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of the law of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man. But though this be a state of liberty, yet it is not a state of license." The reason why men enter into society is the preservation of their property. In the end, why they choose and authorize a legislative is that there may be laws made and rules set as guards and fences to the properties of all the members of the society, to limit the power and moderate the dominion of every part and member of the society. The generation of social scientists who began their careers in the 1870s sought to convert political economy into the scientific discipline governed by laws equal to Newtonian mechanics. Their objective was to formulate an economic model that could be described by a solvable system of equations. Another strong motivation of the late 19th century economists was the growing demand by government for statistics. Militarism and industrial production required an understanding of a nation's population and its skills, natural resources, and productive capabilities. In this era of imperialism, aggressive nation-states also sought similar information on other lands targeted as potential colonial acquisitions. The new generation of economists were only too willing to oblige. One of the early economics pioneers was William Stanley Jevons, first trained in Britain as a chemist and mathematician. His lasting contribution to economics was the theoretical concept of general equilibrium, the assertion that all relations in an economy are self-regulating, so that any disturbance sets in motion forces tending to restore the balance. This is often shown in the simple graphical representation of supply and demand curves. Jevons theorized that in purely competitive markets, the forces of supply and demand interact to bring us to a state of general equilibrium. Expansion-minded military-industrial states required precise information on what political economy described as the factors of production: land, labor, and capital, at home and abroad. What motivated the leaders of these imperial empires was the need to control sources of natural resources and a steady supply of cheap labor, with what amounted then and now to a near total disregard for environmental destruction, the welfare of the labor force, or human rights generally. Individuals as well as societies have choices to make. Economists provided advice by gathering and publishing data on scarce resources and analyzing how choices would affect the output of different types of goods. This analysis is displayed graphically as something called the production possibilities curve. For militaristic regimes, the key trade-off is between the output of consumer goods, referred to as butter, and the needs of the military, guns. An early leader of the economics discipline was Richard Ely. Richard Ely received his undergraduate degree from Columbia University and a doctorate in economics from the University of Heidelberg. From 1881 to 1892, he held the professorship of economics at Johns Hopkins University and was subsequently professor of economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His influence over the theoretical direction of economics continued long after his death. Ely struggled to reconcile the system developed by prior generations of political economists with the new economics. In his 1909 textbook on economics, he begins with an observation with which most political economists would fully agree. He writes, "In the first stage of man's economic development, nature is the great factor in production. There is little labor and less capital. It follows that there was little ownership of land in the sense in which we now regard ownership. The notion of land ownership develops only when the land itself becomes more useful and when the fruits of its fertility can be more directly appropriated than could happen when land was used for pasturing." However, in his discussion of nature and the claims to the ownership of nature, Ely makes no moral judgment nor raises questions of justice. He merely describes the circumstance as it exists. Man does not create these natural treasures, nor give direction to nature in their formation. Some nations have deemed it unfair that they should become the property of individuals, and have therefore treated them as a common heritage, exacting a rent or royalty for the opportunity to exploit them. This is perhaps generally the case today on the continent of Europe, but English law, with its inclination to the exaggeration of private rights, has long established the principle that he who owns the surface owns downward to the center of the earth and upward to the sky. As far as Ely was concerned, that was the end of the issue. Political action converted the earth, our common heritage, into the realm of private property, and there the planet would remain. Vilfredo Pareto was one of a small group of economists who sought to use their position and teaching to promote progressive changes. In so doing, Pareto risked both ostracism and censure. He believed, "The man in whose power it might be to find out the means of alleviating the sufferings of the poor would have done a far greater deed than the one who contents himself solely with knowing the exact numbers of poor and wealthy people in society." Pareto may have adopted the methodology of the economist, but he was a political economist at heart. Another dissenter within his discipline was Scott Nearing, who began his studies at the University of Pennsylvania in 1901 and earned a doctorate in economics in 1909. He then began teaching sociology at the Wharton School, where, as described by his mentor, he, quote, "had the largest class in the university. There were 400 in his class, and no one could have done his work better." Nearing's undoing was that he became immersed in progressive social causes. He was dismissed in 1915 from the University of Pennsylvania because of his public opposition to child labor and other progressive causes, including his support for Henry George's single tax campaign. Nearing charged that academia had sold out to privileged interests. He wrote, "The liberal and radical forces of American life, the men and women who had sacrificed, suffered, labored, and struggled to make America safe for democracy, were brushed aside by the triumphant patriotic plutocracy. Morgan, Rockefeller, Guggenheim were the great patriots. All who opposed them were traitors. The plutocracy had always stood and still stands for special privilege in its most vicious form." During the 20th century, economists on the left and the right began to take sides on the matters of class conflict and wealth distribution. Yet even John Kenneth Galbraith, one of the larger-than-life figures of this era, observed, "Things may be less than good, less than fair, even less than tolerable. That is not the business of the economist as an economist. The economist's task is to stand apart, analyze, describe, and where possible reduce to mathematical formula, but not to pass moral judgment or be otherwise involved." Henry George is aptly described as the last of the great political economists, and his proposals were at one time thought to be more dangerous to the status quo than those of Karl Marx and communism. The reason is that George campaigned for a market system cleared of monopoly privileges. Of Henry George, John Kenneth Galbraith wrote, "In his time, and even into the 1920s and 1930s, Henry George was the most widely read of American economic writers, both at home and in Europe. He was indeed one of the most widely read of Americans. As many younger men sought academic credentials in economics from European universities, the older generation of political economists gradually lost their positions and influence back in the United States. Columbia University became center stage for the intellectual and political storm that developed in the United States during the late 1800s. Columbia's chairman of the Department of Economics, E.R.A. Seligman, frequently clashed in public with Henry George. With financial donations from the likes of J.P. Morgan, Columbia University's economics department grew to become one of the largest in the United States, and its faculty one of the most vigorous in defending the status quo. E.R.A. Seligman, supported by many of his colleagues and the generation of economics professors who graduated from their programs, ushered in an adherence to a new neoclassical economics. In this analysis, nature, or land, was removed as the first and primary factor of production with its own unique characteristics. Mason Gaffney, a longtime professor of economics at the University of California, described how the reclassification of land by Columbia University professor John Bates Clark as just another form of capital and rent as surplus income associated with land, labor, and capital was used to affect public policy choices. Gaffney wrote, John Bates Clark did not stop at subsuming land in capital. He also makes a great point that wages are rent too. The policy implication is that wages would make a good tax base. Seligman carried this forward into the income tax, leading to the present tax system, which raises much more from payrolls than property. The confusion and distortions have only worsened. In the language of economists today, there is but one factor of production, capital. And for capital, neoclassical economics asserts that the price mechanism will always clear markets. That is, market forces will determine the price at which both buyers and sellers agree to exchange goods or services. Another bastion of neoclassical economics was Johns Hopkins University, established in the early 1870s with the fortune left by Baltimore businessman Johns Hopkins. Much of his fortune had come from stock owned in the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Richard Ely joined the faculty at Johns Hopkins University as its chair in 1881 and remained until 1892. His influence over the discipline was further cemented by his founding of the American Economic Association in 1885, serving as the association's president from 1890 to 1901. In another bold move to control what was being taught, John D. Rockefeller endowed the economics program at the University of Chicago, and Frank Knight was brought in to chair the department in 1917. Knight provided his perspectives in the 1940 essay, What is Truth in Economics? Economics and other social sciences deal with knowledge and truth of a different category from that of the natural sciences, truth which is related to sense observation and ultimately even to logic, in a very different way from that arrived at by the methodology of natural science. But it is still knowledge and reality. Yet the early 20th century was characterized by intense controversy over the direction in which economics was taken by its newly crowned intellectual leaders. One of the more vocal critics was Professor Harry Gunnison Brown. Harry Gunnison Brown graduated from Williams College in 1904, then began graduate studies at Ohio State University. He earned his doctorate in economics at Yale in 1909 under Irving Fisher, one of the pioneers in the development of mathematical economics and econometrics. Brown taught at Yale through 1915, then moved on to the University of Missouri. Throughout his professional life, Brown remained convinced that economics was tainted by bias on behalf of vested interests. He wrote, "The conclusions reached in economics may, in case they come to be widely understood, seriously affect the interests of various persons and classes. And if these classes are numerous or influential, they are fairly certain to find spokesmen who can give effective expression to their dissent. Such expression may not be scientific, but it will often be couched in forceful rhetoric and be reasonably plausible." The truth is that few of the thousands of students who take courses in economics absorb much of what is taught. As Robert Frank has reported, studies have shown that when students are tested about their knowledge of basic economic principles 6 months after completing an introductory economics course, they score no better on average than those who never took the course. We've reached the end of Lesson 1.